Good afternoon. I'm Tom Brooks, the General Manager of Western Dubuque Biodiesel, located in Farley, Iowa. Joining me today are two of the smartest guys I know in the industry, Scott Fenwick, the Technical Director for Clean Fuels America, and Scott provides the key support for technical aspects needed by renewable fuel stakeholders to effectively position the biodiesel industry. And on my left, Matt Herman, the Senior Director of Renewable Fuels Products Marketing with Iowa Soybean Association. Matt works to ensure current and future markets value the multiple environmental benefits of soybeans and soy-based products. Iowa continues to lead the nation in biodiesel production at 349 million gallons last year, about 20% of the U.S. biodiesel production. However, we're seeing a major expansion of renewable diesel production across the country as well. Trade press is full of stories about the future of these fuels, as well as stories pontificating on the availability of feedstocks and the possible cannibalization of biodiesel. Given Iowa's leading position in biodiesel, there are a lot of question marks that need to be answered. Today, our panel will peer into their crystal balls, share their vision for biodiesel as they see it. Scott and Matt, we are both going to be talking a lot about biodiesel, renewable diesel and R&D, sustainable aviation fuel or SAF, carbon intensities or CIs. Can both of you take just a few minutes to tell the audience in layman's descriptions what each of these items mean? We'll start with you, Matt.
Well, I'll start with the carbon intensity piece, and I'll let Scott go through the process description. But I think a lot of us are aware, we've been in this industry for a while now and are aware of what California and others have done. But essentially, these markets now are moving away from valuing and incentivizing fuel on a volumetric basis and are looking more towards looking at the carbon intensity or the carbon footprint of that supply chain. And so you've heard some discussion up here on the stage today that the carbon intensity of that supply chain includes all the things associated with producing that fuel, from growing the soybean seed, processing it at the crush facility, Tom making biodiesel, and then ultimately burning it in the car. But a major piece is, not only for corn ethanol, but especially for soybean biodiesel and other vegetable oil-based fuels, is indirect effects too. So this indirect land use change is a piece of the carbon intensity outside of the direct effects. And in our case, it's over 50% of the total carbon footprint. So we've got to really be thinking about managing what's going on in the supply chain and opening up avenues to reduce that and allow our producers to make more money. But we've also got to be thinking about, from a feedstock standpoint and an agriculture standpoint, what data can we bring to bear, what opportunities exist to help reduce the indirect emissions too, because that's in some ways even more valuable to reduce that number for the agricultural community.
Scott?
Well, first of all, thanks, Tom, and a huge thanks to the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association for this event. Clean Fuels just held its annual conference in Tampa a couple weeks ago, and I walked away from that, as Monty said earlier, probably more energized at this point in my career, and I've been in the fuels industry for nearly 35 years. I am more energized about the prospects and potential for biodiesel than just about any other time. After hearing from a lot of our producer members and my knowledge and our work that we've got ongoing with our other industry partners, I think now is a perfect opportunity to be in the biodiesel business and renewable fuels business in general. If you've been in this business longer than just a couple years, it's a roller coaster. And we've all joined in to play this game, so to speak, knowing what the rules are. And they've been laid out for us in the RFS for nearly 2 decades. And obviously, we would get a turn to roll the dice once a year. Obviously, the renewable volume obligations that were just released by the EPA, weren't to our liking. And we've got an opportunity to address those in D.C., and you heard a lot about that on the previous panel. But as far as opportunities and potential, I've never been more excited.
Scott, hardly a day goes by without news of a new advancing renewable diesel project. 20 years ago, we saw the same thing with ethanol expansions. Like then, not every announced project is likely to be completed. Looking through your crystal ball, can you tell us what the R&D industry is going to look like in 12 months and then the next 5 years?
Yeah, I think it's a real testament to you in this audience today, how successful you've been. You've literally turned the tide of the petroleum industry, and I don't want to say that as a blanket statement. Certain companies within the petroleum industry that have now decided, well, we haven't been able to successfully kill the RFS, we might as well join it and make some money while we do it. And so, yeah, if you total up all of the announcements that we've seen and heard over the last 2 years, it would be overwhelming. We've already seen some refining entities come and go. They tried to venture into it, couldn't get enough feedstock at the time, and so they've already backed out. I think time will tell, and I certainly believe in capital markets, and there will be some changes out there for us to experience. But I certainly don't think that renewable diesel is that tsunami that's just going to wash everything else away. I think there's still plenty of opportunity for biodiesel.
Matt, a significant expansion in biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation is only possible with feedstock expansion. Do you see feedstocks as a limiting factor? What's on the horizon to help biofuel producers access more raw materials in the next year, the next 5 years?
Yeah, so I think you're right. The premise of the question is, without significant lipid expansion, whether it's through soybean oil, canola, a cover crop, something else, we're going to, have limits on what we can do from a lipid-based fuel standpoint, whether that's biodiesel, renewable diesel, or SAF. But I do think that as we think about the broader market that's coming, right, renewable diesel is no longer just a lipid-only fuel, right? We've seen the LanzaTech pathway, the LanzaJet pathway that EPA approved the other day. It's majority of it's for sustainable aviation fuel produced from ethanol, but some of that product is also going to be renewable jet. And just like renewable diesel producers have the ability to vary between certain amount of renewable diesel and certain amount of renewable jet in their process, the alcohol to jet guys, the ethanol to jet guys will have that flexibility as well. So I think the kind of the caveat to this is, yes, there's going to be limits on certain aspects of the feedstock pool, and if your process is really dependent upon lipids only, you're going to be kind of in a feedstock limited position, is there's going to be increased competition for that. If you think that the renewable diesel and SAF world is going to be a little bit broader and have more of these fuels, more of these feedstocks that may rely on sugars or wood or other things, then I think there's a lot of opportunity out there. So it's going to be, different speeds of growth, I think, for different markets.
Okay.
Tom, if I
Yeah,
may,
go ahead.
real quick. Again, as a testament to success, the American Soybean Association, ASA, just announced a couple weeks ago, and I'm sure most everybody here knows, there's a huge expansion of the crush industry that's ongoing. And the expectations are in the next 2 years, an additional 35% production capacity for crush. And again, that's huge. Now, in my role as technical director, I don't like to talk about feedstocks the same way, nobody knows what crude oil their diesel fuel came from. It really shouldn't matter what feedstocks are used, although we are worried about the finished fuel properties. But the more interesting thing I heard from ASA at the time was, while we do see and heard announcements for about 35% expansion in crush, about a $5 billion investment, they expect crush to double by 2030, 2035. And so that's 100% capacity increase, not just that 35% here in the next couple of years. I think that's a huge boom to today's farmers.
Okay. Thanks, Scott. Matt and Scott, both of you. Whether it's competition for feedstocks on the front end or competition for the end markets, the increased demand for renewable diesel is clearly going to change the dynamics for traditional biodiesel producers. What should biodiesel producers be doing to position themselves for a brighter future?
So I think one of the strategies that biodiesel producers are going to really have to employ is, it's almost a know your customer, right? One of the opportunities that biodiesel has, I think, over renewable diesel, of course, it's cheaper to procure, but it's produced in a more distributed manner. And so if you've got, for example, a fleet customer with multiple locations around multiple states, and they've got sustainability goals, whether they're legally binding or they're voluntary, they're put on by their investors. They're looking for solutions, high blend solutions, to be able to reduce their emissions at a low cost. And I think that's one of the big benefits that biodiesel has, where, yes, we know renewable diesel has a lot of value, but that's only because it's being sold into these extremely high value markets like California or British Columbia that are double incentivized. And so I think for the biodiesel producers in the future, they're going to have to think about really marketing strategically. And to the extent that they're not in this LCFS market collecting this LCFS credit, they at least need to be able to articulate the environmental benefits to their FedEx, to their UPS, or to their fleet customer to help them understand, okay, this is how I take a carbon intensity number, and this is how you as FedEx, for example, can report this against your scope 1, 2, 3 emissions for your ESG, your investor-led goals. And I think that's going to be a really critical piece for extra margin capture for the biodiesel producer versus simply just selling it over the rack for the year.
Yeah, for over the last several administrations, there are obviously key words, that we use. During the previous administration, you did not want to say climate change or sustainability. It was all about energy security, domestic jobs. Well, now it's about decarbonizing. And so one of the things I think biodiesel brings to the table, as Matt mentions, we are the lowest cost option, bar none, within the liquid fuels industry to decarbonize. And so while it may have been convenient several years ago to sell to truck stops across the country, because obviously, that's where over 60% of the diesel fuel gets consumed, is in on-road trucking. But one of the roles that Clean Fuels takes to heart in my program is we want to address those technical barriers in just about any diesel-fueled application, any market, to provide our members additional opportunities. May not be as lucrative as California. Those LCFS credits are financially, a huge target. And obviously everybody wants to shoot for that. But there are other markets, home heating oil in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states, railroads, marine fuels, that they're not as enamored with renewable diesel as some other markets are. They're going to be looking for lower cost options. And I think that's where the biodiesel producers today can maybe turn a little bit in attracting new customers and new markets that maximize that profitability for themselves towards decarbonizing what many are considering in this administration those harder to decarbonize markets.
So Scott, you mentioned bioheat a little bit. I'd like for you to expand a little bit on it. Biodiesel's been trying to unlock the home heating oil market in the Northeast for years. Recently, there was some news about B100 certification for heating boilers. What's the status of that market, and does biodiesel have a chance to play in that market?
Yeah, we think that's going to be, well, they think, forget about what I think for a minute. The heating oil industry themselves passed what they called the Providence Resolution several years ago, where they hit certain targets towards greenhouse gas reductions. And part of that is 100% reduction by 2050. And they don't want to go all electric. Electric heat pumps aren't as efficient in really cold temperatures like they just experienced last weekend. And so they want to stay with liquid heating fuels. Biodiesel offers, again, that low-cost option. And so whereas a few years ago we got some pushback from that industry, those equipment manufacturers that weren't yet sold on biodiesel and its performance, they now are helping us push through additional state incentives, pushing through regulations, helping address national building codes to help keep their family-run businesses alive so that they can continue to supply home heating, comfortable heat during winters for families throughout the Northeast. I think you're right. I think we're now seeing Underwriters Laboratory or UL approvals for equipment for use up to B100. That is a huge step that a few years ago may have been unattainable, but they see it as the next step towards their role to helping the U.S. decarbonize.
I think one other opportunity that's going to come out of that market, and it's kind of bringing two loose ends together here is, there's of course the home heating angle in that market, but there are several commercial applications and what I call semi-industrial applications that use fuel oil for heating in the Northeast. A really good example of this is you can see it here in Ames at Iowa State. They have a power plant at the university, and that has steam tunnels that run out and heat the university. In the Northeast, there's a lot of examples where those universities are heated by fuel oil. And for a long time, that's been kind of a pretty big target of the biodiesel industry to say, hey, EPA, we can generate RINs on renewable heat. This is an option to do this. But technically, we've been prohibited from doing that because a lot of these universities that are consuming millions of gallons of diesel fuel to heat are also making electricity at the same time. So they're making heat for the campus, but then running that steam through a back pressure turbine and making a little bit of electricity. Because of that technical nuance, EPA said, no RINs at all so far, guys, none at all. Now, I understand that the eRINs pathway that's in the rule only addresses biomethane, but if I was a producer, I would be immediately going to EPA and asking for eRINs on biodiesel and a reciprocating engine, not only for applications where biodiesel could be used in a genset at a, say, Facebook or wherever, but also in an application where it's generating RINs in a combined heat and power situation. I think that's going to be an area where we can start to get a lot more biodiesel moving through the system into these terminal and rack positions and help facilitate more distribution in the home heating market too.
So Matt, biodiesel might not even exist if it not for research and market development funded by the Soybean Growers Association. At the same time, biodiesel, R&D, and SAF will all likely look to soybean oil as a feedstock. As a group representing soybean farmers, not fuel producers, can you share how Iowa Soybean thinks about this future?
Sure, and I'll talk a little bit about how I think about it, and I can tell you that my board has an opinion on it, and even among that board, there's a very diverse opinion on there, so I don't want to be caught as speaking for my board on this issue, but I think as they think about it and I think about it from a grower's perspective, is our job in part is to help educate, inform, and then create demand for the products, for the whole soybean and the products that derive from them. And so, when we think about the livestock market, for example, one of our biggest customers nationally is chickens. Here in the state, it's hogs. Dairy is another large component of that. But generally, the checkoff doesn't sit there and try to spend money encouraging one market or the other. They're really trying to support demand overall. Now, recognizing that with biodiesel, they invested pretty heavily to get that technology off the ground as a way to disappear oil in response to disappearing demand for vegetable oil following the trans fat ban. That has been very successful. Now we're in this world going forward where there's going to be multiple competing demands for vegetable oil, and I think fuels is one aspect now, and there's a lot of value with it because of the associated renewable credits for LCFS or RINs. But when we look at uses for vegetable oils going forward, because vegetable oils chemically, and Scott can attest to this, look so closely like so many petroleum molecules, there is going to be demands for these products that we haven't even thought about yet. And there are going to be applications for these products that are very niche, but very, very high value. And they may seem niche to us in the grand scheme of the petroleum space, but that space is so huge compared to the amount of vegetable oil that we consume that I really encourage the farmers, yes, we've spent this time, we've spent this money developing the biodiesel industry, and we shouldn't leave them behind, but at the same time, we need to be evaluating every market with an open mind and every potential market that could come to us, because we need those diverse options and those diverse marketing channels if we would lose one versus the other.
Thanks. Scott, one of the emerging markets for biodiesel seems to be rail locomotives and ocean-going vessels. Can you talk to us a little bit about both of those industries and how you see biodiesel fitting and working in helping their climate change objectives?
Yeah, one of the things that I've always enjoyed and thought so highly about the biodiesel industry is its tenacity. Because trust me, our initial fuel quality issues that we saw 2 decades ago still leave a bad taste in some organizations' mouths, and we're still addressing that. But these industries that didn't want anything to do with us just 3 or 4 years ago are now calling us saying, hey, we need your help. We're running short on options because while we talk about biofuels, renewable fuels being policy fuels, and that's obviously the case. There's federal policy, there's state policies. The one thing that seems to be taking over and driving our industry are ESG goals, environmental, social, and governance goals. So these are the Amazons, the Googles, the Nikes, the Walmarts in the world, telling their shipping companies, you will reduce your emissions or we'll find other suppliers. And so we're working with a couple global shipping companies, Maersk Shipping. And so these largest ships, and they jumped into this, without being pushed or prodded by us. They realized they had to decarbonize. They took it upon themselves about 4 years ago to start to investigate biodiesel. And right now in Europe and the Far East, the average marine fuel supply is about 40 to 45% biodiesel. And they want to go to B100. In fact, we're working with the international group in charge of marine fuel specifications. Those should be published early in 2024. It's going to allow for up to B100 use in every marine fuel grade. And they realize that that's their best option today. Sure, they're going to continue to work on methanol. They'll continue to work on ammonia, maybe even fuel cells out there. But what they have now and what they know are combustion engines. And renewable fuels like biodiesel, again, are the lowest cost option towards decarbonization. And they work seamlessly in their engines. Rail, we think, are the same way. They're caught between a rock and a hard place. The largest railroads in the country, Class 1 railroads, buy their locomotives from really one of two companies. And it really is a warranty situation, unlike on and off-road vehicles. So the railroads are buying these locomotives. They've got a service plan. They return them to the manufacturer for overhauls and such. And the locomotive manufacturers only currently approve up to B5. So we've provided data to the railroads, the locomotive manufacturers for the last 10 years. We know it works. Yes, there are still fuel-related issues. And I say that because I don't believe they're biodiesel-specific issues. There are always fuel-related issues. And the railroads have come to realize that, yes, they can manage those, and they can decarbonize with biodiesel. And so now we've got their support in putting upward pressure on the locomotive manufacturer. And I think you're going to see the tide turn with railroads and marine fuels, that they're going to begin to consume more and more of the biodiesel that maybe had gone into other applications like on-road trucking.
Do you think there's a appetite? We need Kurt on stage for this question, really. Right. Do you think there's an appetite for those of you who don't know in the room, you can't generate RINs on biodiesel that's used in a marine ocean-going vessel. And it's long been kind of a thorn in the side of this market.
That's one opportunity that I may beat Kurt in an arm wrestle, because from a technical standpoint, we've answered their questions. Is it possible? Is it feasible? Do they get the same performance? Yes, yes, yes. But as Matt mentioned, you've got to retire the RIN if it's used in an ocean-going vessel. Now, that's been part of the rules ever since the RFS was published. It might be a pretty severe undertaking, but there are ways that, working in DC, working with the shipping industry, and rather than us being at the forefront of that ask, if you get Stolt Shipping, if you get Maersk on Capitol Hill saying, hey, we need the help of the U.S. to decarbonize when we're in your waters, using your fuels, I think there's an appetite for that.
Okay. Matt, what is your outlook for biofuels to capture value from a reduced CI associated with farm-level GHG accounting?
Yeah, so this is a huge issue not only for the soybean biodiesel folks, but I know it is for the corn ethanol folks. So really the question is, is California or another market going to give us credit if a farmer participates in a conservation action, whether that's like a low-till, no-till, cover crop situation? I think the answer is yes. In fact, there are certain markets that are doing it today. The European market for a long time has allowed this type of activity. If you've ever been able to do a cargo or a sale, whether it's biodiesel or to ethanol to Europe, there's the ability for you to basically use the ISCC certificates and work with your farmers and note their actual production and production emissions and their management practices and take credit. So at least know there's one corn ethanol producer who is very successful in claiming lower carbon intensity ethanol and supplying it to Europe through their interaction with the farmers. California, I think it's a very different story. I think we've got two challenges there. They're both political, shocker. One is the fact that I think California sees any additional credits. Now, I'm not saying this is right, but I think they see additional credits from the biofuel market as kind of detrimental to their long-term electric vehicle goals, especially if those credits are just coming attached to existing biofuels and are not necessarily new incremental biofuels coming into the program displacing petroleum. I think the other problem with California is, and this is not one that's well understood, but you've essentially got two accounting books. CARB has their AB 32 legally mandated climate goals, and that's measured using one set of inventory accounting, and then they've got a separate set of accounting books that they run LCFS off of. And that separate set of accounting books does not cover essentially the farm emissions. So even if we would reduce, sequester carbon in the soil, those benefits, while they would affect the LCFS, are not going to help CARB achieve their legally binding targets. So that's a huge kind of headwind that I see from this. I think we've got a lot of opportunity in Canada, and I'd really encourage the industry, soybeans, biofuel, ethanol, corn, everybody to really engage with the Canadian the legislators, stakeholders, rulemakers, to see if there's an opportunity to really connect these two markets. I'm not sure how that will turn out ultimately. I know that with the LUB criteria, there's a lot of incentive to go down to the farm level, but it'll be interesting to see if we're actually able to make that connection. The last thing I'll say on this is the big challenge I think that soybeans is going to have in this conversation is with corn, you leave a lot of residual biomass on the field, and that can ultimately become soil organic carbon and create an offset for your corn. For soybeans, we just do not leave a lot of residue on the field, so that's one challenge. The other challenge is if you really dive into the life cycle analysis and you look at what's driving emissions in the corn system and the soy system, they come from very different sources. With corn, it's largely synthetic fertilizer, and we've got some management schemes that we can use to wrap our heads around that. In soybeans, about 70% of the emissions that Argonne assumes come from soy are either from biomass decomposition, so the biomass staying on the field and the residue breaking down, or where Argonne assumes that there's N2O emissions created from the soil bacteria during nodulation. So that's just part of the plant growing. That's just soybeans producing its own nitrogen. So that's the big challenge that we have for soy is, we can put 100% biodiesel on every tractor. We can run all of our sustainable zero carbon fertilizers, and we're only reducing the carbon footprint of soy by, a couple grams. So it really comes down to, for the farm standpoint, it's going to come down to cover crops to offset the emissions and then reduced ILUC on the carbon intensity for soy.
Thanks, Matt. This question is for both you and Scott. Scott, Matt, biodiesel offers an immediate low carbon solution as it can be a bridge fuel. While some seem to want to wait for heavy duty batteries, green hydrogen fuel cells, what are the real benefits for incorporating biodiesel today versus waiting 5-10 years?
Yeah, I think all too many regulators, legislators, fuel purchasers are looking for that silver bullet. What's the easy answer? I can sit here and tell you there isn't one. It's an all of the above solution. And not every solution is going to work in every application for every customer, but biodiesel brings so many benefits to the table. As a low carbon fuel, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. One of the other things that we tell our OEM partners, our vehicle and engine manufacturing partners, they're quick to tell us, is that the only thing changing in the fuels, faster in the fuels world than the fuels themselves, is the engine technology. And so we're up against some new regulatory requirements and emission requirements beginning in 2027 for medium and heavy-duty trucks. And right now, some of those OEM partners don't know how they're going to meet these new requirements. The good thing is, as long as we've partnered with them and been honest with them, giving them, as much information as we can, they're giving us the benefit of the doubt. And so we've got some testing ongoing right now on some developmental engines down in Texas that'll never see the light of day. They'll never be put into a vehicle. But they've got some proposed new after-treatment devices that the industry thinks may be their best solution to meet these new emissions requirements. And just this week, they're testing B20, B50, B100 to see where we're going to stand here at the end of this decade. Again, right now, I would argue that biodiesel can be used in any diesel-fueled application in any concentration. We're registered with the EPA as a fuel and fuel additive at any concentration. A lot of people refer to a B20 blend wall, and Iowa's going to break through that with some of their recent legislation. And while I think that's really exciting, I think any of you, anytime, can use B30, B40, B50 in your vehicles today. Now, I've already said fuels, liquid fuels have some challenges, and those challenges need to be managed. But I think that the benefits we bring to high-pressure common rail engines with our lubricity, with the oxygen content that biodiesel brings, reducing our emissions, as well as being that low-carbon, low-cost liquid fuel, whereas they don't have to change their engine technology, they don't have to change their fueling infrastructure, is a pretty attractive option for a lot of people.
Thanks, Scott. Well, as Matt gets ready to answer, if you have a question, please step to the mic. We've got a few minutes left before we wrap up.
Yeah, so I think Scott hit on a lot of the benefits. I mean, Clean Fuels has done a lot of work looking at both the time value benefits of reducing carbon emissions earlier rather than later, and there's a compounding effect to that, and the same on the health benefits side. I think, while the science that Clean Fuels has done certainly bears it out, the difficulty that the market faces right now is monetizing that. And, there isn't a kind of an early RIN credit generator, right? You don't get more RINs for generating them earlier rather than later. I'm not sure we'd want that. I think one thing that will kind of help us in this space, though, is in the voluntary markets, the greenhouse gas protocol changes. These are the rules that govern companies' voluntarily stated goals. They're actually going to require them to start to discount these reductions out over time in a much more financially sound method. So I think that's really going to help these companies understand and start to value, hey, if I use biodiesel now, I am avoiding this emission and not going to incur it as a debit on my books for the next 100 years. So I think that's very valuable.
All right. Go ahead.
With the 20 new crushing plants and the $5 billion worth of investment, where do we think the acres for that is going to come from? Is that going to be corn acres that are shifted away to soybeans? Where's the production going to come from?
So it's largely going to come at the expense of exports. So rather than the U.S. is exporting a large, over 50% of their soybeans today as whole beans. So what will change is the soybeans will be processed inside the United States. The oil will be used domestically, and then the soybean meal will be exported. So the big challenge that the industry is going to have to face is rejiggering the export system from exporting whole beans, which have their own set of handling equipment and storage, to exporting soybean meal. And so that's why you see projects like AGP in Grays Harbor. They're going to double the export of their soybean meal capacity there to be able to bring more trains out and load those to be able to serve Asian markets. And I don't think we've seen anything down on the Gulf Coast yet, but I've got to expect it's going to come.
So Matt, following up on that, can you tell us about the shift in the value of meal versus oil? Because he used to grow the bean for the meal.
Right. Yeah. So historically, and I'm not Mac Marshall with United Soybean Board, so if I get my numbers wrong, please don't hold it against me. But historically, soybean oils carried about 30% of the crush margin, right? So it's 20% of the overall mass of the product that comes out. It contributed about 33% of the margin. Now we're in a situation where the soybean meal, which is 80% of the mass that comes out of these plants, is really only carrying 50% of the margin. So what that tells us is what's really driving this expansion and driving value in soybeans is largely the oil share. And a lot of that has to do with the expansion of these renewable diesel plants and these announced demand centers. We've also got compounding factors, literally COVID issues with supply chains that we're still working out. I mean, these vegetable oils globally do play off each other. So when Malaysia and Indonesia, who's the world's largest supplier of vegetable oil in a very manually labor-intensive market, isn't able to put that supply onto the global market, that's going to bring all oil prices up. And then you've also had, I think we're on our triple dip, 3 times of La Nina in a row, which have also pressured global vegetable oil stocks. So all these factors have really led to this run-up in soybean oil prices, which are helping carry the value share of the crush right now.
Thank you. So as we wrap up here, if there's no more questions, for both of you, 5 years from now, you've got your crystal ball before you get ready to put it up for another year. What do you say we have in store, or what's on the show floor for the next 5 years for biodiesel and biofuel markets in general?
Well, Clean Fuels announced its vision several years ago, and that's to be a 6 billion gallon per year market for biomass-based diesel fuels by 2030. So just so you've got a comparison, 2022, I think according to EIA data, federal data, we were 3.2 billion gallons consumed of biodiesel and renewable diesel. So we're going to almost double here in the next 6 years, 6.5 years. My prediction is we'll hit that target of 6 billion before the end of this decade. Now, with some advances in feedstock and feedstock technologies, our next goal is to be 15 billion gallons by 2050. And as we see feedstock prices increasing, as we see increased demand for our fuels, I think that's going to spur more and more development in feedstocks, which then in turn comes back, and it's a continuous cycle feeding our industry. I won't sit here and tell you that biodiesel is going to be half or a majority of the market. I think certain markets, we may not contribute any. Other markets, biodiesel may be 100% of the renewable fuel that they use. And on average, I think the markets will figure it out. There are, again, lots of reasons, lots of advantages for different applications for different fuels. And it's up to consumers and the markets to figure that out. But again, I can't tell you how much more excited I am today than maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Because we've got applications and organizations coming to us today that are asking how to get more and more of your fuels that didn't want anything to do with us 3 to 4 years ago. And so quality assurance is at an all-time high. One of the things that we've done at Clean Fuels in our BQ9000 quality system is try and put together an annual report over biodiesel quality. And some of the engine manufacturers that aren't big fans of biodiesel, wanted to throw out to EPA their instances of consumer complaints. And of course, they would blame that on biodiesel. Flat tires are caused by biodiesel. Broken radios are caused by biodiesel, amongst a number of other things.
Windshield wipers, yeah.
Windshield wipers, exactly. EPA, California Air Resources Board, looked at our annual quality reports for the last 5 years, and they basically told some of those vehicle and engine manufacturers, sorry, but we've got data here that says otherwise against the claims you're making. And so, again, I can't tell you how much more excited I could be today that we are overcoming these hurdles and these challenges. And there remain quite a few, but I'm confident in the work that you guys are doing and the work that the industry as a whole is doing with each of our partner organizations. We're going to check those boxes one by one and continue to move the industry forward.
Thanks, Scott. Matt?
So I'm going to take a page out of Scott's book here and not make a prediction on the industry volumes, because that's folly. Okay. I will put myself in a position I don't want to be in. I think that the most exciting part out of the next 5 years, and I think I would say this even if I didn't work for an a farm organization, is the developments that are going to come in feedstock and on the farm. I think both looking at what we talked a little bit about earlier of trying to connect that value on the farm through the value chain to producers, I think that has an enormous opportunity to drive some of these traditional conservation benefits that we've been chasing on the farm, but haven't really had the right or strong enough market signals to get those. So whether it's Soil and Water Outcomes Fund or the Cargill program, being able to connect those to biofuel suppliers who can access these much more lucrative regulated environmental markets is going to be really key. I think the other thing, and Scott touched on it, is whatever way you slice it, no matter what technology you think is going to win or become dominant, we're going to need more feedstock. I mean, just to put it, simply, I think it's something like we make globally like 40 billion gallons of renewable fuel, as a whole wide world. And just looking at diesel and jet fuel demand, it's like 550 billion gallons. So you can have enormous demand destruction in these petroleum markets, and you're still going to need renewable fuels to come in and help serve some of these very difficult to decarbonize markets that are going to take a long time. So for our soybean farmers, they're producing soybeans and corn today. Those are both going into renewable fuels. There will certainly be rotations in the future where we see somebody try to sneak in successfully, hopefully, like an advanced oil seed, whether it's a cover cress or a carinata or some type of other alternative oil seed. I think that there's going to be a big future, too, with the eRINs rule for farmers to be able to add value from their cover crop biomass today that they're just terminating with glyphosate. So I think really farmers they're one of the only professions out there, right? They're one of the only industries that's actively taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it somewhere else. The question's going to be what markets come up for them to take that carbon value in that biomass and deploy it. And I think renewable fuels are going to continue to lead that way for the foreseeable future.
Scott and Matt, I thank you both for your time, your insights, and your willingness to participate here on the panel.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.